Well, I feel I've been very nicely looked after coming here at rather short notice, and it's a great pleasure to see many people that I've corresponded with or read papers from that I'd never met before. You're not a sea of faces in front of me. You're not even an ocean of bodies. You're like a great amorphous biomass sitting there looking at me, because I can hardly see and I'm nearly deaf, and if you saw me walking across the floor you'll see that I fall over and I look as if I'm drunk, but I swear I'm not. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to be here. All right, my title is what does MSY mean? Where does it come from? Can it work in practice? I was being falsely accused of being a father of MSY, and I vehemently say I'm not. In fact, the culture in Lowestoft, where I did my work 50 years ago or more, primarily was we're looking for moving in the right direction, not moving towards optima. And that is still where I come from. However, when the Commission announced that they would be aiming at a new policy of MSY, I welcomed it 3 years ago and wrote quite a lot about that. Not because I believed in MSY or any version of it really, but because it signified that the Commission was prepared to look for sustainability, but also to look for recoveries of overfished stocks towards larger sizes and so on. But now, many of the things I'm likely to say might not be very welcome to you. I don't feel very well prepared because I was supposed to be going to a workshop that Steve was organising later in the year, and suddenly I found myself coming to this one. I'm not going to say much about where MSY comes from. You can go back, I've written all this up, it's in a book that International Fund for Animal Welfare published 3 years ago on sustainability. We start with Verhulst's law of the growth of human populations and his big quarrel with Malthus early in the 19th century. And then we come to people who have engaged in that discussion in a way about growth of populations: Darwin, Marx, Huxley. Huxley reported to the UK Parliament about overfishing in the end of the 19th century, and they were beginning to get clear about overfishing. And someone in the Parliament, after he presented the Commission report of which he was chair, I should say that Professor Huxley believed that fish were infinite. And it was right at the end of his career, just before he presented his report to Parliament of Britain, that he suddenly decided, as a result of a Danish scientist, Carl Peterson, working and showing that we actually affected the number of place in the sea, and they weren't infinite. So Huxley had just sort of seen the light about overfishing, and then some parliamentarian said, well, you've told us, Professor Huxley, that overfishing is too much fishing, so there's an obvious cure to that: less fishing. And that's basically what I want to talk about now. How did we landed with MSY as a political objective? It comes from the peace conference between the United States of America and Japan at the end of the Second World War, when the Americans were trying to find a good reason for excluding Japan from fishing in the eastern North Pacific. And they invented the idea of MSY. I mean, there'd been discussion about it from earlier years. As a political aim, they said basically to the Japanese delegation, if we on the coast are fully exploiting the fish stocks, then you can't come in and start fishing off our coast. And the Japanese said, what's fully exploited mean? and the Americans said, you're catching MSY. And we've been stuck with it ever since. They tried to universalize this in 1955 at the first UN conference I ever went to. They failed to convince people, but gradually it's got into the final version of the Law of the Sea as a qualified maximum. It was really first presented, the idea of an optimum, as it was called, was presented by Johan Hjort and his Norwegian colleagues who looked at the population dynamics of yeast, of herrings, and of the blue whale in the Antarctic. And it was to the blue whale, they said, there's an optimum intermediate fishing mortality rate. They didn't use that word. And that's what we should aim at. So the whales were in it from the beginning, and then 1960 onward, I went on to spend almost the rest of my working life working on the whaling issue. And I decided after I was writing and preparing for this talk that basically fin whales are overgrown hake or anchovies. That is to say, and I mean that seriously, that it turns out that the population dynamics of the fin whale, with the sole exception of the difference in the density dependence of scale of reproductive rate, are essentially the same, and I'll try to explain why that is. So I was looking for generalities. If we're going to look for a universal rule to apply to the whole of the EU and using the UN's words to fix that, then as much as we can, we should look at what are common to all fishes, practically common to all aquatic animals, in fact, as well, including the whales. So anyway, I went back to fish from whales 3 years ago, and I was asked to get involved with the EU's decisions. I was corresponding with a colleague in California recently, in fact, the day before I came here, and he wrote to me. He referred to me as Rip Van Winkle, if you know the name of the old man who went to sleep in Washington Irving's old long story, and then woke up 20 years later and found the world had changed. So I became Rip Van Winkle to some of my colleagues in California recently. So I start with the Commission's statement, which I've got here. Fisheries management shall aim to ensure by 2015 that exploitation of living marine biological resources restores and maintains populations of harvested species above levels which can produce the maximum sustainable yield. And the question that was put to me by parliamentarians about 6 months ago was, how far above levels? I didn't like talking about levels. I have a strong objection to the treatment of a fish population as an amorphous biomass. I think its structure by age and sex and size is at least as important as biomass. And in fact, I consider that the so-called surplus production models for the use of them in fisheries model in management, other than just teaching first-year students something about population dynamics. I think this is a perversion of our science. Fish populations are not biomasses, and I'm reminded that populations of the same species of exactly the same biomasses can have totally different biological productivities. So it's rather misleading to be concentrating on that. Anyway, what do we mean by above levels? What I mean is fishing mortalities below those that would produce a maximum sustainable yield of some kind. Now, the Commission defines biomass at present as the maximum catch that can be taken from a stock indefinitely. with my colleagues, some of us have preferred to, you can't elaborate that definition very far in the legal sense. We'd rather talk about average catches and sustainable, of course. And I prefer what the scientists of the International Whaling Commission decided 10 years ago was cumulative catches, which can be the same thing. But to talk about maximising a cumulative catch emphasises the reality that sustainability must be time defined. We cannot do computable measures if we leave sustainability as an open-ended term, meaning infinitely into the future, quite apart from the fact that the ecosystems are going to change and so on. We have to take a particular time. The whaling scientists took 100 years for reasons I could explain to you. Said, okay, we're going to maximise the cumulative catch over a 100-year period or over some fixed period. This is an absolutely essential point to me in discussing sustainability. I'm not going to make any apology for talking about the dynamics of single stocks, although a lot of people don't like that. I think if we talk about that, single stocks in steady states, not in equilibrium, then we can build up from there a policy for much more complex situations. I'm not going to talk about transience, the movement from one state to another, though that is also extremely important in practice. I'm not going to talk about mixed fisheries because that's something we can talk about later. And I'm not going to talk about the estimation of parameters at all. I realise I'm narrowing things down. But I will have something to say about economics, and at the end, if there's time, about management measures, but perhaps we'll talk about that tomorrow. I consider that economics is the core problem by which, the resolution of which, we can move perhaps to an agreed sustainable management system. But it cannot be reached by looking just at physical quantities of catches. So we're looking at computable quantities, in my view. And I'd like to quote one of my favourite scientists, Galileo Galilei. I'll give it to you in English, in not Florentine. Measure what can be measured and make measurable what cannot be measured. I also like Galileo's comment that he defined wine as light held together by moisture, which I think was a really nice way of putting it. So we're talking about empirical studies and applicable models. I'm also going to talk about the yield per recruit models that Ray Beverton and I produced many years ago, with very similar to models by Baronoff after the First World War, Bill Ricker in Canada, and so on. Because these are fairly simple, they're the simplest models I can think of which would illustrate the main points I want to use. I'm not pretending that they're the be-all and end-all of population dynamics. But I'm also going to talk about a simplified model, simplified version of that model, which was published and has been used, which we look not at age of fish, but at the weights of fish. And when we do that, we find that instead of the dynamics being described by the natural mortality of the fish and the growth patterns of the fish, but instead by the relation between those two properties, that is by a ratio, in fact, of two parameters of our model, of the natural mortality rate and of the parameter which defines how fast the growth of a fish slows down as it gets bigger. And what we find is, and this is what I've been looking at for the last 6 months, is that we find that, as I said, whales become just like anchovies. The ratio of the two parameters actually has a very narrow empirical range, even though the actual mortality rates and the growth rates can be hugely different. And this means that we can generalize a little bit about the properties of the models. I've said I don't like surplus yield models. I think that they're at all, but there are some very specific reasons why I think they cannot be used at all in this discussion of serious management measures. And the reason is that the shapes of the yield curves from those models do not match with what actually happens in nature. And this is why we have to use models which actually contain the factors of growth and mortality. Each point on a curve of yield against fishing rate implies a biomass of the exploited stock, which is different from the biomass of the mature stock, which may be related to reproduction, or to recruited stock, or even to the total population, which I won't refer to as stocks. We want to be able to generalize, as I've said, as far as possible, so we can't have different rules for every species and every fishery, as far as the dynamics of populations will allow us to do that. The synopsis that I wrote for this meeting, I don't know if it's been distributed or not, but that was my intention. But much more, the long brief that I've written for Parliament gives many worked examples of the factors I'm going to talk about. There are a couple of other things that we have to remember in discussing this subject. It's commonly assumed in talking about sustainability, the sustainable use of wildlife or fish or whales or whatever would be profitable just because it's sustainable, just because it's aiming at reasonably large populations maintained to give large catches. But that is not necessarily so. Not only is a sustainable catch not necessarily profitable, but even a maximum sustainable catch is not necessarily profitable. If we don't have regulations which lead to profit, that is, I'm putting it in the simple sense of the value of the catch in the market being higher than the cost of taking it, very crudely. If we don't manage so that there is profit for somebody, not necessarily maximal, then there won't be any sustainable catch anyway. There won't be any fishing. So unless it's subsidised or it's allowed to continue as a mining exercise rather than a sustainable use. So this is the first thing that I concluded that I came to, is that if we're going to get somewhere on a sustainable yield curve, it has got to be profitable. That means it has got to have a low enough cost, which is essentially a low enough fishing mortality rate being caused, which will produce catches which are more valuable than the cost of taking them. My mentor long ago, Michael Graham, Director of Fisheries in Britain, in England rather, wrote during the Second World War, fisheries that are unlimited become inefficient and unprofitable. And this is, I think, very fundamental property of, let's say, free fishing as long as there's a market for a product. That's why we're talking about sustainable catches if we can. Now, the important thing about age-structured population models that actually use growth rates and mortality rates in them is that they produce curves of sustainable yield against fishing intensity, fishing mortality rate or whatever, which are flat-topped. And this is an essential property that we need to look at or take account of when we consider how far below the let's call it the optimal fishing rate we want to go in management. Now, I did some lot of calculations on a whole range of all the values of the basic parameter of the ratio of natural mortality rate to growth rate, and that the other parameters in these age-structured equations. And the thing that came out was that for every parameter value that I could find anywhere in the literature, and a rather narrow range of measurements, the flat top nature of the yield curve means that you can get a catch, a sustainable catch, very close to MSY with a very much less fishing effort than you need to actually get MSY. Many of the calculations I did, and I tabled them all for all the range of values I could find. You could say, let's accept that we'll grant ourselves 95% of the theoretical maximum catch. And it turns out you can always get that with much less than 95% of the fishing effort. You can get it with 80%, 70% of the fishing effort, because those yield curves are flat-topped. What I found too was that if you look at the biomass of the exploited population, which is being reduced by fishing to maximum sustainable yield level, so-called, this is always between 10 and 20% of the so-called virgin biomass, the biomass of the unexploited fishable stock. It's not 50% as Benny Schaefer and others assumed, it's not even 30% as many fisheries biologists have assumed from looking at general surplus production models. It's way down at 10 to 20%. Now this is makes going for MSY rather dangerous, because you're down, as Pamela and her colleagues have discussed, to levels where you are almost certain to be affecting the reproduction of the stock, the recruitment into the stock, which generally we assume is not much affected by fishing until fishing has greatly reduced the stock. So then I started looking at the maximum economic sustainable yield, not as a target, just to see where it is. And you can actually deduce that with rather little data, just by looking at the dynamics of an expanding unsustainable fishery and where it ends up when it becomes unprofitable, as Michael Graham said. And what I found was that the maximum economic sustainable yield, that is the greatest difference between the value of the catch and the cost of taking it, is always somewhere around a bit less than 50% of an MSY level. If you're prepared to sacrifice that much, you can maximize probably, and I'm not saying these are absolute, but they're very general and throughout the whole range of populations I was looking at. This led me to start thinking about what I consider to be almost a tragedy of accepting MSY, which was forced on the world politically as the main target of management, and also tried to meet that target by setting catch limits. I think that setting catch limits is possibly the worst way of trying to direct a fish stock towards an optimum level, and I can explain that when we start discussing that. It has tremendous problems, and many of them have been met with simulation studies and so on. I have likened it to trying to drive a car. Are we 5 minutes away? Driving a car by using only the brakes while you keep your foot on the accelerator. Engineers do not regulate machinery by controlling just the output, they control the input. Now, if we go down to low biomasses or low to high biomasses that are still well below the MSY levels. This brings with us other benefits: less impact on the stocks, on the ecosystem, less unintended kills and discards, bigger fish in the catch, less drastic modification of the natural properties of the stock, and therefore less unexpected events and lower risks of irreversible actions. In talking about all this, I was reminded that Michael Graham also said something into the 1955 Law of the Sea conference that I attended on the Secretariat working of the United Nations at that time, what are called the Great Fishing Experiments, that is the 2 world wars, which showed us that fish would recover when generally we could predict the recovery when fishing was relaxed. Graham told the assembled delegates of the United Nations that the trail of fisheries science is strewn with the opinions of those who, while partly right, were wholly wrong. And I've been thinking about that a lot recently. Finally, concerning moving away from the management, from the forms of management that led to its destruction of so many fishes, another statement of Charles Darwin's: to kill an error is as good a service as, and sometimes better than, the establishing of a new truth or fact. So what I'm looking at is going way down below, far below the so-called MSY levels. I haven't talked about what MSY really is. I've had to leave that out, but I tend to think really of MSYs as fractions of the absolute MSY that you can obtain by maintaining selectivity of fishing at a certain level, what I call local MSYs, and that's what most people are looking at when they're looking at curves of sustainable yield against fishing mortality rate. I'll say more about that later, perhaps in our discussions later on. But I want to finish with my all-time favourite quotation. I like quotations. It stops me having to think too much myself. It's from Donald Rumsfeld in the Bush administration, who made a remarkable statement. Never liked him as a politician, but I liked what he said just before he retired. As we know, there are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are unknown. There are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know that we don't know. And I think we often find ourselves in that situation in fisheries management. Thank you.